All right, y'all, we're back for Spooky Scary Storytime, the series where we share listeners' allegedly true stories about the creepiest or most unbelievable things that they think nobody else would believe, or that they've been too afraid to share because they're afraid that people are going to call them crazy. We won't call you crazy here. We believe you. If not, we like these stories. Anyway, we're going to get right into it. Before we get into the stories, though, have you guys heard about the Bigfoot sightings in Ohio? It's all over Portage County over the last 6 or 7 days. There's been something like 8 sightings, and all of the people are describing the same creature. I don't cover too many Bigfoot stories on here or many cryptid stories in general, but I am curious. I like anything unknown or spooky. So if you've heard about that, if you live in Ohio, let me know if you've seen anything. But we'll get right into the stories. There's no common theme, just general creepiness. I hope you all enjoy. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. I have a spooky bedtime story for you. This story just keeps getting weirder and weirder. It's called The Fog is Weird Tonight, and it was submitted by a listener named Kat. If you're new here, this is Spooky Scary Storytime, the series where we share listeners' allegedly true stories about the creepiest or most unsettling things that they've ever experienced. And Kat says that she's lived in the same small mill town in Washington State for the past 30 years, but the story really starts when she, her husband, and their children moved into a new apartment. About 2 months after moving in, she woke up around 4 in the morning to pack her husband's lunch and set out his clothes for the day as she normally did. She kissed him goodbye, and about 5 a.m. she went out to her balcony to have some coffee and sit outside. It was on the second floor of the building, and she watched him walk across the parking lot, enter his truck, and pull out of the parking lot. She had just sat down in the balcony chair when all of a sudden from the ground level she heard her name being called, and it was her husband's voice, and he was saying, "Cat, Cat." So she looked over the balcony thinking maybe she missed him pull back in, maybe he had forgotten something, but she didn't see him. She didn't see his vehicle, so she thought maybe she imagined it, or maybe there was somebody else in the building who was named Cat, and her husband had a similar voice. She was still looking over the balcony. She heard whistling coming from the other direction, so she turned her head to look, and it wasn't somebody whistling a song. It was alternating between high and low notes. So she turned her head, and as she did, the whistling changed direction, and now it was coming from the woods behind the building. She turned her head in that direction to try to determine the source of the sound, but as she turned her head, the whistling changed direction again. Thoroughly weirded out, she decided she must just be sleep deprived and decided to go back inside, close the balcony door, and went back to sleep. But shortly after falling back asleep, she was awoken by a loud thud coming from her balcony. So she left her bedroom and went out into the living area, where she saw her balcony door was now swung wide open. She walked across the living room and closed the balcony door, and she says her balcony is about 12 feet off the ground. She didn't understand how it opened, but thought maybe she didn't close it all the way. But she says that night is really the start of all of the strange occurrences that she and her family experienced. Shortly after that, she was home alone one day when she heard one of her children call "Mom" from the other room. Her children were at school. After that, her children started complaining about hearing giggling coming from another empty bedroom. Family dog, who up until this point had been very well behaved, started going berserk at night, growling and barking and snarling at shadows, appeared seemingly without source on walls or under doors. Children started hearing her calling them when they were home and she hadn't called them. And one night her son, who was 14 at the time, woke up and said that he had heard strange whisperings in another language in his ear as he slept. That said, she told her son to just ignore it and go back to sleep. But she didn't feel like whatever was in their apartment was bad or malicious. She didn't get an evil feeling from it. And she says, in fact, one night she thought that it actually saved her. She wasn't feeling well and went to get some water from the kitchen. It was the middle of the night. She was groggy and she almost fell down the stairs, but she felt someone grab her from behind and pull her back, so she fell flat on the floor instead of forward down the stairs. She assumed it was her oldest child, but when she turned around, no one was there. She also noticed that anytime the family was missing something, they would just say out loud, "I'm looking for my keys," or "I'm looking for my ring," and then whatever object they were missing would just show up on the coffee table. They lived in the apartment for 3 years, and while these experiences never lessened, they became so accustomed to them that they started calling this energy their invisible roommate. She says they all just kind of accepted that there is some kind of presence there. But here's where things get spooky again. Says in December, she and her oldest child decided to take a walk to their local store. They often do this, and it's only about an 8-minute walk from their apartment to this store that they frequent. And the walk is well lit. There's streetlights everywhere. And with this being December, there were Christmas lights all over their town. And she says their town is only about 500 people. So it's normally pretty quiet as it was, but that night was particularly quiet. And she said the fog was just so thick that night that something felt off. There was no one out walking, but it wasn't the emptiness of the streets or the fog. She said that she's from the Pacific Northwest. She's used to that. It just felt like she was being watched, but she didn't want to freak out her son, so she decided she wasn't going to say anything about it. But about halfway to the store, they stopped at an ATM, and as she was pulling money out, her son says, "Mom," in this shaky voice, and she looks at him and he says, "It feels like we're being watched from every single direction." As I said, she had kept her own feeling to herself, but when he said this, that freaked her out more. And he says, "It feels like we're being hunted." And that's when she realized that none of the Christmas lights on their street were turned on. None of their neighbors who usually hung out on their front porches were outside. None of the neighborhood dogs were barking. There was no sound of wind. In fact, there was no sound at all. There was no traffic on the street, and she said this was abnormal because even though their town is small, it was 7 p.m. on a Friday. By this point, the fog had gotten so thick that it was almost snuffing out the lights from the street lights. But they're approaching the store, and through the window, they can see their favorite cashier who's staring at them, and she has this strange look on their face. So they quickly enter, they grab their items, and they go to the counter. As Kat is paying, she's talking to the cashier about the fog. She said, I've never seen anything like this. And the cashier says, yeah, we haven't even had any regulars come in tonight since the fog rolled in. And I think the fog is messing with the security cameras. And Kat says, what do you mean? Cashier says, well, I was watching the security cameras when you two were approaching the store, and on the cameras, it looked like there was a dark shadow of a silhouette of a person following you, but when I looked outside, there was no one behind you. That said, she felt her blood run cold, but the cashier says, don't worry, I think it's just the fog messing with the security cameras, but please walk safe. The fog is weird tonight. Kat and her son left the store and were being very vigilant, looking around them, making sure that they were not being followed. But she said that at one point during their walk, about halfway home, she heard what sounded like two hoof prints on the pavement behind them. Both of them turned to look, but there was nobody there. They began walking again, and the hoof prints resumed. But she said it was distinctly two, not four like a horse. Every time they turned around, the sound would stop, but when they began walking again, it would follow. Picked up the pace and were almost home, and they were passing a house owned by a sweet elderly couple that they know. The house was dark, but as they passed, the living room light turned on, and Kat looked at the house and saw that the man was standing in the window. She said the look on his face chilled her because he was smiling at them with this cold, calculated smile that didn't reach his eyes. Really creeped out, Kat waved at him as she normally did, but he didn't react, and the light switched off behind him. Said her son was terrified, and she just told him, let's just get home as quickly as we can. So they picked up the pace again. But as they did, the sound of hooves behind them also picked up the pace. Just before they reached their apartment building, they were passing a church with pine trees outside. And Kat said she doesn't know where this thought came from, but something just popped into her head, and it said, pick some pine needles up and give them to your son. Kat said this is unlike her. She doesn't know why she had this feeling to pick up the pine needles, but it was just this intrusive thought, this gut feeling. And so she did as she was instructed. And holding the pine needles, she says they reached their apartment building. And as soon as they did, this feeling of warmth washed over them and they felt like they were instinctually safe. All of them immediately collapsed onto the couches upon entering their unit. And her husband said, what happened? And she told him the story. And he said, I think it was just the fog. I think you two were letting your imaginations run wild. But she said they both distinctly heard the sound of the hooves behind them. Both witnessed their elderly neighbor staring at them with a creepy smile. And both felt the feeling of being safe once they picked up the pine needles. But says she believes they were being followed by something, and that feeling of warmth that they both experienced was the entity, their invisible roommate, that was trying to protect them and comfort them. Says she knows that what she and her son experienced was very real, but she's sharing this because she's curious to know what you all think the entity in their apartment is. Not only that, but what was in the fog, and what was the sound of the hooves, and what did the pine needles have to do with anything? She really is curious as to what others think, and she will be reading and responding to the comments. She also said she's had an aura reading done, and the person that did the reading told her that she was a beacon, but she also doesn't understand what that means. So let her know if you have thoughts on what that means too. And if you have a spooky, scary story that you think nobody would believe or that you've been too afraid to share until now, send it in. This community would love to hear it. This Spooky Scary Storytime was submitted by someone named Michelle, and she detailed her experience meeting a fellow traveler while on vacation with her mother. It's creepy, it's spooky, but it's also interesting and a little bit curious as to what was really going on here. But she says that in 1997, she and her mother were taking a vacation to Puerto Vallarta, and Michelle was very excited because she had never been out of the U.S. before, and their plans for the vacation were simple. They were just going to hang out by the pool at their hotel, they were going to go to the beach, and they were going to go whale watching. Elle says she has always been very outgoing, and in addition to speaking fluent English and Spanish, she can also hold conversations in 5 other languages. It's something she's very proud of, and she said within the first few days of her vacation, she had struck up conversations with travelers from France, Sweden, Germany, and Brussels. She had also struck up light friendships with locals from different parts of Mexico, and she said this was exactly the kind of lively international atmosphere that she had hoped for in traveling somewhere outside of the US. And very early on in her vacation, she also met an Australian traveler named Oliver. And he was about 18 years old. He was very short and petite. She said he was about 5 foot tall with bright red hair and freckles. He was very enthusiastic, and she said that he had the kind of excitement that someone on their first big adventure carries. And he was traveling alone, but he had an around the world ticket. But his first stop was Puerto Vallarta because he had an aunt who owned a restaurant there. It was Oliver's first time in Puerto Vallarta as well, but he had been there for a little bit longer than Michelle and her mom. So they strike up a conversation and they're talking about travel and cultures, and Oliver's telling her all about the places he's been, and she's telling him all of the places she hopes to go. Michelle said it was a very easy conversation. It was nothing romantic. It was just two travelers sharing stories. And after about an hour of talking, Oliver suggests them grabbing some coffee at a cafe he had found recently that's about 15 minutes from the hotel. So they take a cab there. They arrive at an open air cafe, and she said it was gorgeous. It was an outside patio setting, shaded by tall palms with warm ocean air coming in. Serving cafe con leche in colorful glass cups, and warm pastries had just come out of the oven. The place smelled delicious. She was in heaven. She said she felt safe and peaceful and relaxed. They sat there for quite some time, but as they were finishing their coffees, Michelle said she actually still had half a pastry on her plate when Oliver stops laughing and he looks at her and he says, "Do you see the man standing over there staring at us?" And she looks over and she sees this extremely tall man, about 6'6", who has this unnaturally dyed bleach blonde hair that's standing up in stiff spikes, wearing mirrored sunglasses that reflect themselves back to them. And she says he's standing about 10 feet away. But as she looks at him, he smiles. And she said his dentures were poorly fitted. His teeth were too large for his mouth. He seemed to take her glance in his direction as an invitation for him to join them. But she said what disturbed her the most about this man was the way that he moved. Instead of turning his head, for example, he would turn his entire upper body. His movements were stiff and robotic, and she says the only way she can think to describe his movements accurately is he was as if he was a machine that was learning the way that human bodies worked and trying to mimic it. And he's beelining straight for their table. And she said he was still smiling the same creepy, cold, and calculated smile. And she said as he approached them, her stomach dropped and she just felt this sensation of something being very wrong. Michelle and Oliver were sitting at a table directly across from each other, but it had 4 chairs. And without asking, the man sits in a chair between them. He ignores Michelle completely and he turns his attention on Oliver. And he says, "I know who you are." And Oliver looks confused and he says, "You're Jewish, you're from Australia, and you're traveling the world." Oliver's face changed to one of confusion, to one of horror. His face went pale, and each time the man spoke, he revealed something more and more personal about Oliver and his life. He said, "You went to this school growing up, and your father's name is this." And the things that he was revealing to Oliver that he knew became more and more personal. Michelle said things that no stranger should have known. Finds it hard to explain, but says that she felt the air around them grow heavy. It was as if time itself slowed down. And out of nowhere, she has this intrusive thought that says, "He wants his head, he wants his brain." And she's thinking, where did that come from? And the thought repeats, "He wants his head, he wants his brain." She says she has no idea where that voice in her head came from, but she truly believes that it was the Holy Spirit warning her, her words. That her pulse raced faster, and she knew that she had to get these strangers' attention off of Oliver, so she pipes up. She tries to interrupt, and she says, "If you're so psychic, tell me something about me." But the stranger doesn't even glance in her direction. He continues talking to Oliver, and she said it was almost obsessive. It was compulsive, the way that he was revealing facts about Oliver's life, and they kept getting more and more personal. She said it was as if this man was hungry for something that Oliver had, and the conversation at this point had turned deeply disturbing. And said she didn't know what else to do. So in her head, she started praying and she said, "Give me peace from this man, make this man leave." And as she said it in her mind, a deep sense of calm and peace washed over her. But as it does, the man turns and sharply looks at her and says, "There you go. You feel better now, don't you?" Just as quickly as she felt calm, she now felt panicked again. She felt the blood drain from her face. And she said, "Who are you?" He said, "I just knew at this point that he was not normal." But he smiles again and he says, "I am the Messiah." Stomach twisted, she knew that they had to get out of there. So she raised her hand. The waiter came over. She asked for the check. She paid. And she basically drags Oliver out of there. And as they're outside, they're trying to get a cab. Oliver is hesitating, though. He's looking over his shoulder. He's looking back toward the man who is paying his own tab inside the restaurant. But she gets a cab. She said she basically had to practically pull Oliver into the cab. And as they're pulling away, the man comes barging out of the restaurant shouting, "I am the Messiah. I am the Messiah. Come back." In the cab, she looks at Oliver and she says, "Did you know him?" And Oliver just shakes his head and she goes, "What was that all about?" And Oliver just quietly says, "What if he really was the Messiah?" She said she stared at him in disbelief, not believing that he would fall for the ramblings of what she thought was a crazy man. And she said that as soon as they got back to the hotel, she warned him not to go near that man again. She said, "I can't explain it, but I had this feeling that he wanted your head." Oliver just stared at her in disbelief and he was like, "But he knew things about me that no one else could know." "I don't care what he said. I have a horrible feeling about him. And I know we just met, but you should not go by that man again." And Oliver just says, "Okay, I'll think about it." But the sun was going down and he said, "I have to get back to my aunt's house." They said their goodbyes and agreed to meet the next morning at sunrise at a beach near his aunt's restaurant. Came and she went out to the beach where they had agreed to meet, but he never showed up. And she said she didn't see him for the rest of their 2-week vacation and still wonders what happened to him. But about a week after this incident at the cafe, she and her mother were walking along the boardwalk with some locals they had met, and they were headed toward a bar called the Cactus. And all of a sudden she looks up and she sees a man sprinting directly toward her. As he got closer, she recognized him. It was the man from the cafe. So she screamed and started to run. And a man that they were with, which was a 6-foot-tall bodybuilder named Juan, stepped in front of her to block him. He stopped and locked eyes with Michelle. And he said, "You kept me from talking to him. You kept me from Oliver." That I was absolutely dumbfounded. I didn't know what to say. All of the people she was with started asking, who was this man? What did he want from her? How did they know each other? And as this man realizes that this crowd is asking questions, he turns and he runs off in the direction from which he came. About a block away, they saw a police officer who they flagged down, and they described the man in detail and reported what happened. And the officer said that he would keep an eye out, but nothing much came from it. Few days after that incident, she and her mother were headed to a bar that they had visited earlier in their trip. And as they're approaching the bar, she sees him again, and he's standing outside of the bar. He's pacing back and forth, and he's talking to himself. She froze. She was terrified that he would see them again, but they slipped into another bar quietly, and when they came back out, he was gone. Their final day in Puerto Vallarta, she saw him one last time. He was at a restaurant and he was sitting with a big group of people, smiling and talking and laughing as if he were completely normal. And she said that's what disturbed her the most, because she knew he was not normal, but he could apparently blend in and act normal if he wanted to. Michelle says to this day, she is still convinced of one thing. That man was not human. She doesn't know what he was, but she says even thinking about this causes her to have intense waves of anxiety, but she thought it would be therapeutic to write it out. Send it in. She says she has her own idea of what she thinks he was, but is more so curious as to what everybody else thinks he was. But she said she does believe that he intended to harm Oliver, and says she does think that he would have eaten his brains had she not ruined it for him. I think I made the stick people angry. This spooky scary story time comes from Cade, and he says that he has always been a very logical person. He has never believed in anything that he couldn't see with his own eyes until this experience. And he says that he believes he's being watched by stick people, and he had never heard of this before until a strange encounter with an old woman in the woods. And from what I gathered, stick people are often described as thin forest spirits that sometimes watch people from the trees, or other accounts say that they can enter homes without permission. They're described as being thin and tall, but they can also take the form of humans. Some lore even suggests that stick people are where the urban legend of Slender Man actually came from. Cade says that he is 32 years old and he has lived in Oregon for the last 17 years, and he often enjoys hiking in Mount Hood National Forest. And he had never experienced anything strange there before. He always just saw normal hikers or people jogging. But one evening late last year, he was hiking a less used trail, and he said it was approaching dusk. He realized that he should probably get back to his car. He had been out there for a while, and the forest had gotten really quiet. He couldn't even hear birds in the trees. As he was about to turn around, he noticed a woman standing about 20 feet just off the trail in front of him. And he said she was unnaturally pale. She was very short and petite. She had very long gray hair past her knees. She was wearing layers of old clothing, and she was not moving at all. But she was staring directly at him. So he decided that she may need help. And he approached her and he said, "Ma'am, are you lost? Do you need help getting somewhere?" She didn't take her eyes off of him, but she said, "You shouldn't be out here walking alone." And he said, "Oh, it's okay. I live right by here. I walk out here all the time." She stared at him a moment too long. He actually wondered if she had heard him at all. And he says, "Ma'am," and she says, "They're watching you." He said he didn't know what to make of that. He thought maybe she was having some kind of mental health crisis, and he assumed she meant maybe the animals. But she didn't say anything else. She just kept her eyes locked on him, and he said, "Who's watching me?" And she said, "The stick people," gesturing behind her to the woods. This is where he says he messed up, and he thinks he accidentally angered her and possibly the stick people, because he says, "Oh, the stick people, what are they, Bigfoot's cousins?" He said as soon as he said this, the woman's face changed. She went from calm to furious, and she looked at him and she said, "You shouldn't mock them." Her voice was very harsh, and he felt uncomfortable. So he said, "Okay, I'm sorry, ma'am. Do you need help getting somewhere?" And she said, "No, I'm fine. I'm at home." He said at this point he didn't want any more interaction with her. He turned around and said, "Okay, well, good luck out here." As he's walking away with his back toward her, he hears her call out behind him. They don't like being laughed at, and he turns around, but she's gone. Cade said at this point he wasn't worried about it, right? He said that Oregon is full of people with all kinds of different beliefs, and he just thought he encountered maybe somebody who was enjoying the woods a little bit too much, if you catch my drift. So he goes back to his car, he heads home, and nothing strange happens until a few nights later. It was a Saturday night. He had gone to bed early and he wakes up to a loud banging downstairs at about 2 o'clock in the morning. He said he heard footsteps. He said he heard some things sliding across the floor. He thought maybe they were moving furniture and he assumed that someone broke in. He lived alone. It's a standalone house, so he has no upstairs or downstairs neighbors or anybody that could be making this noise. So he locks himself in the bathroom off his master bedroom and he calls 911. And the dispatcher asks him where he located and he tells her and she says, okay, stay there. I'm going to send somebody out. While he's waiting for police, he said he heard all kinds of shattering, like glass breaking, things being thrown. He was sure that whoever was down there was doing some damage, but police arrived shortly later and they cleared the house and they said there was no signs of a break-in and nothing was broken and nothing was missing. Cade said he had no explanation for it because he was sure that he heard those things. It wasn't like he was dreaming. He was awake, he was on the phone, but there was nothing to be done. 2 weeks passed and nothing happened out of the ordinary, so Cade said he tried to put it out of his mind at this point. And it was around Christmas time, and he and his girlfriend drove to her parents' house about 2 hours away from where he lived. One of his neighbors was feeding and watering his cat. And one night about 7 p.m., as he's at his girlfriend's parents' house, his neighbor calls him and he thinks there's an issue with the cat, so he immediately picks up. And his neighbor says, hey, did you by chance come home early? And Cade says, no, I'm still here. Why? His neighbor says, well, I was leaving your house and I was locking the door and I heard some footsteps upstairs and something moving. He said it sounded like furniture being moved and there were definitely two voices talking up there. And he says, never mind, I'm going to call the police right now, but I'm just letting you know that this is going on. I think there's someone in your house. Cade says the police came out, they checked again, but there was no evidence that there was anybody who had forced an entry. No windows broken, the doors were locked, and there was nothing out of place. A month after that, Cade said he had worked late and was pulling into his house after dark. He was in his driveway and the fog was thick that night. The streetlights were eerie, but he happened to look up in his bedroom window and saw somebody peeking at him from behind the curtains. It was just for a split second, but for a moment he swore it was the woman he saw in the woods. She looked pale, she had the long gray hair. He blinked his eyes and she was gone. He said he was sure that there was someone in his house, so he called the police again, and the police came out, and this time they're sort of annoyed. They're like, this is the third time we've come out to this house. We still can't find any evidence of someone breaking in. No windows are broken. Your doors are locked. I actually ask him if he's been having any mental health issues, and he says no, but he actually wonders at this point if he's really making all of this up in his mind. His girlfriend knew all about the situation. She actually suggested that he check his attic to make sure that there was nobody squatting up there. He goes up there. There's no evidence that anyone's been living up there. He doesn't find anything. He has no basement, so it's not like there's somewhere in his house where somebody could hide. But it was really messing with his head. A few more weeks pass, nothing out of the ordinary. He's hoping it's all behind him. Shortly after that, he said he pulled into his driveway one night and he noticed it was another foggy night, not uncommon. But he says the fog wasn't moving naturally. It was shifting into these vertical shapes that almost seemed human-like. It was just a really, really eerie night, so he ran inside and closed the door. But as he looked out the window, he swore he saw multiple figures peeking out at him from behind the trees. But at this point, he's like, okay, it's all in my head. It's just because of what this old woman told me. I have to go back there. He said his logic was if there was something supernatural going on, she would be out there and he would find her somehow. She wasn't out there, he was going to put this out of his mind once and for all and refuse to even entertain the idea that somebody was watching him. The next day, even though it was cold out, he packs up, he takes the same less traveled trail back to the spot where he initially saw this woman, but she's not there and he goes, I knew that she wouldn't be here. But as he turns, he notices something carved into the trees. There's 3 little stick figures, as if a child had drawn them. And that gave him chills in itself, but then he noticed there was another figure carved below them, but it wasn't a stick figure. It looked like a normal human. And below that was carved, watched. He has had it and he heads out and he's like, this old woman just puts things in people's minds. She just likes to creep people out. I'm out of here. I'm not going to entertain this. And he gets back to his car in the parking lot and he notices there's a squad car sitting in the parking lot. And the police officer rolls down his window and he's like, what are you doing out here? Blah, blah, blah. It's getting dark. Cade says that he just explained that he was out for a hike and that he was out there just looking for someone. And the police officer says, who are you looking for? And he says, oh, this is going to sound crazy, but there's this old woman out here and she had long gray hair. And I just had a question for her. I saw her out here a few months ago. The officer raised an eyebrow and he says, what does she look like? And he says, well, she's short and she has long gray hair past her knees. And the police officer cuts him off and he says, is she wearing layers of old clothing? And he says, yeah. And the officer says, yeah, people out here report seeing her sometimes. And Cade's like, does she live out here? And the officer just says, no. Cade says, well, who is she? You know, like, is she playing pranks on people? And the officer says, I think she's just an old rumor, but if you see her again out here, I don't think you should talk to her. It says through the entirety of their conversation, the officer looked extremely uncomfortable, and he hasn't had anything strange happen since and thinks that maybe this was all in his head, but he's still curious. Who was the woman? Was she protecting him? Was she warning him? Was she a stick person herself? I'll be honest, after reading this story, I looked up stick people, and apparently a lot of people from that area and elsewhere report these creatures, these entities, these forest spirits. A lot of the reports are them standing just behind a tree line watching houses. So if you live in the Pacific Northwest, you may want to close your curtains tonight. I got an email from a woman named Lynn who told me she saw one of my psychotic roommate story times and wanted to share her story about being a live-in nanny for a very wealthy family in Aspen, Colorado. The wife apparently was very popular or is very popular on social media, and the husband is just like quietly probably a billionaire. She says she doesn't know how much money they had, but it was a lot, and their behavior is nothing short of just outrageous. So I don't really know what to make of this, but I'm just going to tell you what she said in her email. So she has said she's not originally from this country, but she's very Americanized. She's been here for a long time. And it was always part of her plan that she was going to be a live-in nanny. She'd been doing it for a long time and was looking for a new host family. So one of her friends put her in contact with a woman that she knew through her employer, and she goes to interview with this woman. The house is nothing short of a mansion. It's tucked into the mountains with giant glass windows, and the house is pristine, beautiful. She said walking in, it felt like a movie set. There was no sign of life that anyone actually lived there. She meets the husband and the wife. They tell her they have 2 children. They tell her that they are pretty strict. They have a lot of rules in the household. And the husband is not really talking throughout this whole thing while the wife is talking. And she asks her about her experience as a nanny. She asks her very personal questions like, does she have a boyfriend? Does she keep a diary? How often does she talk to her family? The woman tells her if she takes the job that she will have 2 weeks paid vacation, but that she's not allowed to have any outside guests at the house ever. The woman tells her they travel a lot. She asks if she has a valid passport, and she says that she'll be expected to make all of the trips with the family as they deem appropriate. Lynn said the pay was pretty modest considering the scale of their wealth, but it seemed like a pretty good deal, so she accepts the job. She meets their kids. They're a boy and a girl. They're about 5 and 9, and the kids are quiet throughout the entire introductory process. They barely say anything besides hi. When she moves in, she's handed a list of rules and regulations for the children that she's expected to follow. The rules at first seemed pretty crunchy, Aspen mommy, as she described it. Things like no sugar, no toys with noise, no TV, no screen time. There's also a few things on the list that Lynn described as a little bit odd. One thing was no red foods, not red dye, no red foods, because the mom said that they stain. So no red meat, no red apples, no red onions. Also, no foods that had ever at any point been packaged in plastic. Also on the list is no storytelling and no conversations that have not already been approved by the mother. And ask the mother what she means by this, and the mother tells her, don't talk to them about anything that I haven't already approved. So I'll give you a list of all of the conversation topics that you're allowed to answer questions on. If it's not that, default to me. She also tells her the children both must be in bed by 7:12 p.m. and not a minute later. Lynn was disciplined a lot while living with this family. She said the first time it happened was a few weeks after she moved in. The 9-year-old girl didn't know how to tie her shoes, so Lynn was trying to show her when the mom walks in the room and she says, what are you doing? And she says, I'm trying to teach her how to tie her shoes. And the mother said, I gave you a list of what you were allowed to teach them and what you were allowed to talk to them about, and tying her shoes is not on it. I have a parenting plan. That's not part of it. Please stop. So Lynn stopped. She said the children were extremely well behaved and very, very quiet. Not like any kids that she had nannied before. But she gets called into the mother's office, and the mother basically rips into her and tells her, like, you need to take these rules and regulations that I gave you seriously. And Lynn apologizes, and she says she will. She said basically it wasn't her place to determine how to parent. They weren't her kids. So even though it felt a little bit more like training a dog than it did like raising a child, she decided that she was just going to take the mother's word for it. At this point in her email, Lynn also mentioned that there was a wing of the house that was padlocked and nobody was allowed back there. When Lynn asked the mother what was behind there, she just said it was storage, and even the children weren't allowed to go back there and not to worry about it. Sometimes the parents would have company and they would all bring them to the storage area of the house at night, but Lynn was in her room, and honestly it wasn't her business, so she didn't really mind. She said another strange thing the mother did was sometimes she would be in the children's bedrooms, like at night, reading them a bedtime story, and she would notice the mother would just be like standing outside their bedroom doors, like watching. She was never smiling, she was just staring at them, and sometimes she would say, I'll take it from here, and she would put them to bed herself. She said playing with the children was strange also. Like, the children didn't play on their own. It was like they were always waiting for instruction on what to do. Lynn tried to encourage them to use their imagination, but they would just stare at her and say, what should we do next? One night, the older girl, the 9-year-old, wakes up in the middle of the night and she's screaming, and Lynn goes into her room to comfort her, and she tells her that there's a woman with a glass face standing in the garden. She brings this up to the mother the next day, and the mother just tells her, yeah, we know about the lady with the glass face, don't worry about it. The older daughter's nightmares or seeing the woman with the glass face continues. She keeps complaining about it, and Lynn is growing more and more concerned for her. She thinks she's got like some trauma or just something unresolved that causes her to wake up in the middle of the night. So she brings it up to the mother again, and the mother gets angry, and she says, I told you not to talk to me about it. We know about it. It's being dealt with. And is disciplined again a few weeks later when one night she wakes up in the middle of the night. She's thirsty. She goes to the kitchen, and she was told when she was hired that basically she got a grocery allowance, but she notices there's like a glass jar of ginger juice in the fridge, and she takes a drink of it because she thinks it'll help settle her stomach. I guess she wasn't feeling well. I don't know. She hears noise coming from the padlocked wing of the house. So she walks over, and she described the noise as chanting from a large group of people. She doesn't really know what to make of it. So she just goes back to bed. The next day she's called into the mother's office again. The mother lectures her on waking up in the middle of the night. She says she's expected to sleep through the night. She also tells her the ginger juice was not part of her grocery allowance, and she will be docking the cost of the glass of juice that she had from her paycheck. Lynn said she wasn't expected to keep up with chores around the house. They had a different staff for that. But one day the mother tells her she needs help setting up the dining table. So Lynn begins to set the dining room for company, and the mother says no in this part of the house. And she brings her back, opens the padlock, and they go into this other wing of the house. And she said it was like a whole other house in there. There were bedrooms, there was bathrooms, there was a kitchen, and there was a huge dining room with a giant wooden table and a very strange human-like sculpture in the middle of the table. The mother says, this is the table we'll be setting. And she shows her a cabinet full of fine china, and she has her set the table for 14 people. Mother tells her that night they're having company, and she's expected to attend and sit with the children. So she gives her this new nice black dress. She says, you're wearing this. And that night, 9 guests arrive, and they all sit around the table. Lynn is sitting with the 2 children. The mother tells her beforehand, don't speak unless spoken to. And at one point in the dinner conversation, a man looks at her and then looks at the parents and says, why is there an outsider here? And ignores this comment. She continues tending the children, who don't speak a word throughout the entire dinner. After the dinner, the mother pats her on the back and says, you did great. She instructs her to take the children to bed as it's 7:10 p.m. She gets them to bed. She goes back down to the kitchen because she's like nosy, and she hears from behind the padlocked door that same chant. She says she has absolutely no idea what they were doing, but if anyone has any insight, please let her know. She says she has a million more strange things that happened while she was nannying at this house, but ultimately she quit because she didn't like how the children were being treated. She ultimately felt more like a servant than a paid employee of the family. I got a glitch in the Matrix story time from a girl named Jade who told me about a conversation that she had on a bus that was very strange and still leaves her unsettled. So she was on a bus going back from her parents' house. She was there for the weekend. She always took the bus because she didn't have a car. She said she had done that bus ride a million times. It was about 2 hours away from where she lived. Her bus left later in the evening, so it was already dark outside. There were only a few other passengers on the bus. She finds a window seat, plugs in her headphones, and kind of like conks out. She said she wasn't asleep, but it was like in and out of consciousness type thing, and she felt somebody sit next to her in the seat, like a weight had been put down next to her. So she opens her eyes and she sees a man sat down next to her. He says something. She takes her headphone out. She's like, what? He's like, do you mind if I sit here? She said she was 22 when this happened. He was significantly older, probably in his 50s. He had like silver gray hair, and he had a very distinct jawline. She said she would describe him as an attractive older man, but he was very like angular. So she's like, yeah, sure, sit down. And he's like, thanks. She puts her headphone back in. She's like kind of closing her eyes. She feels him tap her. So she opens her eyes again. She looks at him, and he's like moving his mouth, but she can't hear what he's saying. So she takes her headphone out again. He's like, do you ever feel like things are perfect? Like things aren't real? She's like, what? He's like, do you ever feel like things happen that shouldn't be possible, but nobody else notices? And she's like, what do you mean? And he turns fully to look at her, and he's like glitches. She doesn't know what he's going on about. She thinks he's like on something. So she said, like, although she was like a little bit creeped out, she didn't want to be rude, but she just is like, yeah, sure, I guess. And like turns back to like put her headphone in. She doesn't even close her eyes, and he's talking again. So she takes her headphone back out, and he's like, yeah, I had a feeling you'd understand. She said he was very calm in the way that he spoke to her. And he's like, you see things that other people don't. You see the world flicker. You see the gaps. So she's just like, I guess this is what we're doing now. Doesn't even try to like listen to music again. She's like, I don't really know what you mean. He's like, yeah, you do. So she turns to fully look at him for the first time. She says she looked him in the eyes, but for some reason, even though she knows she like clocked him, like she looked at him fully, but it was like her brain was struggling to process the details of his face, if that makes sense. Like they were almost fluid. They were changing in front of her. She said at the time, she just attributed this to like when you look at somebody in a dark car, like it's going underneath streetlights. So there's light flickering on and off. And like she just thought that that was what was going on and why she couldn't really process his face. So she's like, I'm not really following your conversation, to be honest with you. Like, what's your name? And he goes, I don't have a name that matters anymore. She's like, well, you said that I know what you mean. And to be honest with you, I don't. So he's like, well, I don't know that you know what I mean, but they do. And she's like, who is they? And he's like, the veil keepers. She's like, what? And he's like, yeah, like they're the ones that keep the illusion, that make sure that nobody notices when things shift. He's like, they're the ones that make sure that nobody knows when time rewinds or when people disappear and then they're rewritten. Then he tells her something along the lines of the world that she sees is not real. It's just a projection. It's a layer. Jade said she didn't know what to say at this point. She was fully creeped out, so she just says, well, that's insane. And he says, is it? He says, did you ever have a memory that nobody else remembers, or have a moment in time that feels like it's stretching too long, like something is buffering? And this is all paraphrasing, but she said she distinctly remembers him saying something about time buffering. But it was this comment that made her throat go dry, because she did have an experience like that. She remembered a store close to where she grew up. It was a supermarket that she remembered going to a lot as a kid with her mom. And that store apparently never existed. When she asked her mom where it went or what happened or why they closed down, her mom was like, there was never a store there. And she's like, yes, there was. I remember going to it. But her mom just told her basically that it was just like a childhood memory. She must be remembering another store. So this is what Jade thought of when this man is talking. Jade also had a feeling at this point that the time it took for him to say these words to her seemed to be like stretching. Like it didn't seem like normal conversation. It was like time slowed down. She also had this weird sense of deja vu, but she thought this was just her brain playing tricks on her due to the nature of the conversation. And then the man starts nodding as if he could read her thoughts. And he's like, yeah, the Veil Keeper, they maintain the script. They don't want you to notice. Jade said she just asked him, what does it matter if I do notice? At this point, the bus hits like a bump in the road or something, and they both jolt. The man looks around nervously, and he says, because if you notice, they start watching you. Jade says nothing. She's just trying to process what is going on when all of a sudden the bus's lights flicker. When the bus's lights come back on, he's not there anymore. She said there was a ringing in her ears like static, and it was like her vision blurred for a second. She said at this point, she swears she saw dark shadow-like figures standing all around the bus. Their limbs were wrong, stretched like shadows in the flickering light, and featureless faces that seemed to study her. The bus lurches again, her eyes come back to normal, and the ringing in her ears stops, and she can't see anything out of the ordinary. She looks around at the other passengers. Everyone's just going about their business, reading books, listening to music, asleep, nothing out of the ordinary. She grabs her phone, turns the front-facing camera on, and looks behind her, and she doesn't see anything out of the ordinary back there either. Her heart is racing. She's like, I must have just imagined all that. I don't know what's wrong with me. Maybe I'm tired. When she comes up to her stop, she goes to the bus driver and she says, does this bus have security footage? And he says, yeah, but if you want it, you're going to have to contact corporate. He points to a number that's listed. He goes, call them. So she does the next day. There's a little bit of back and forth over the next week with this company, but eventually they do send her the footage because she lied to them and said that something was stolen from her on the bus. And she sees herself talking to no one next to her. But her blood ran cold because on the footage, after the bus lurched, when it hit a bump, you see her move forward, and then the video seems to glitch. For a split second, there seems to be a figure sitting beside her, but it's not human, and it's a distorted shape, and then it's gone. She said she emailed the company back asking if they have any more footage because there's clearly a glitch in this footage, and they say it just must be a bug, we don't have anything else. She did send me the bus security footage, and you do see something for a split second, but I don't think it's human either. It just looks like a shadow, so can't confirm nor deny. However, she didn't want it shared. You can clearly see her in the video, and she did want to be anonymous, so her name has been changed. She said she just doesn't want people to think that she's crazy or like she has a mental illness. So let her know if you have any idea of what this was, if anybody's had a similar experience. She said she's gone down a lot of rabbit holes. She can't find anything about the Veil Keeper. So if anyone has any insight as to what this man was talking about, or maybe he really was just on something. But then that still doesn't explain why he's not actually on the footage. So let me know your thoughts and keep sending me your spooky, scary stories. I love the Glitch in the Matrix ones. Which story was y'all's favorite? I think mine was the story about Michelle in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. I'm just really fond of they were not quite human type story. So if you have one of those, please send it my way. If you have any story that you've been too afraid to share or that you're just curious for community feedback, please do it. I get all submissions through my website. It's dogoodstaybad.com. There's a story submissions page where you can share your story and let me know if you want to be anonymous or named. I'm always happy to change names or to tag you, whatever you feel comfortable with. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do that on patreon.com/ashleeinc. This is a list of all the people who already help me out with supporting the channel financially. If you can't, no worries. I know times are tough out there. Just you listening and liking and hyping and possibly sharing the video or this podcast with somebody who also enjoys a general aura of spookiness really, really helps me out. I just appreciate you guys so much. I think you're the best community on the internet. I love you so much. Until next time, stay spooky, stay curious, question everything.